Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and get started since it's 1 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and start our presentation. Yes. So today's topic is on accessibility. So when I heard from Code on the Beach that they were looking for speakers to present on this topic, I was super excited because this is a really important topic. Accessibility is about inclusion, so building inclusive products so that everybody can use them, even people with disabilities. It's also a very trendy topic right now, so I'm sure as developers or designers, you've heard the word accessibility or accessible thrown around, but you don't quite know what it means. You know, like, is your colors accessible? How's the contrast ratio? Things like that. So this is good information to know. So question, whose responsibility is accessibility? Designers or developers? Any show? Yes. Ever? Yes. Yes, great, good. It's everybody. So you need both designer and developer to do different things for accessibility, but you also need product to make decisions as well for accessibility. In this talk, we're going to go over the developer side, what we need to add to our code in order to make sure that on our end, it's accessible. There's a couple of other topics out there right now, other sessions about accessibility. There's one going on right now for UX design, so you might be in the wrong talk if you want to learn about UX design. But no, I'm just kidding. Stay here because I'll go over some of that as well. So yes. Okay, so a little about myself before we get started. My name is Charlene Carver. Ooh, they all just came up. I've been working at Beeline for 7 years as a developer. Definitely an awesome company, great culture. I love front-end development and UI UX design. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to come by and talk to me about some topics. I also encourage, if you're in Jacksonville, to check out the local meetups. For the front-end development, there's the front-end development group that's hosted at Allstate every other month. And then for the UI UX design, there's Sketch and Design that's over at Black Diamond. And also there is She Can Code It over at Availity, which is also a pretty awesome meetup. Yes, so like I said, it came up too early, but yes, I have too many pets. Well, that's what my husband says, I have too many pets. But I don't think so. Yes, and they're all named after food, so I might have a problem there. So that's my cat, Pancake, Waffles, and Nori and Mochi. Yes. So I definitely want to make sure that everyone is learning something by the end of this talk. So I have 3 questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this talk. First of all, what is accessibility? Secondly, why does it matter? It might be trendy, but you never want to do something just because it's trendy. You want to know why you're doing it and why it does matter, so we'll go over that. And the bulk of my presentation would be, how can I do my part as a developer? So by the end of this talk, you should know what you need to add to your code to make it accessible. So first of all, what is accessibility? Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web equally. When it comes to web accessibility, we're really looking at 4 different categories of disabilities. The first one would be vision. So if you have no vision at all, like a blind user, you might need something like a screen reader to tell you what's on the screen. If you have a vision impairment, you might need to be able to zoom in really big so that you can read the screen. Also, if you're colorblind and the site uses colors to mean lots of things, you might be confused because you can't tell the difference between the colors. Hearing, if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you might need captions or transcripts for like videos or like podcasts. So that's something to consider. Motor, so if you have limited use of your hands, you might not be able to use a mouse as well as another user. In that case, you would need a keyboard navigation available to you. If you can use a mouse, but you still have limited mouse capabilities, you might need larger mouse targets. And finally, cognitive, which I think is usually the one that people don't think of too much, but that includes people with dyslexia or some kind of reading disability. If text is moving, they're going to have a hard time reading that. People who are susceptible to seizures. If you have content that is blinking, that might trigger a seizure. So you should definitely be aware of that. So along with the types, there's different disability modes. So the one that people usually think about is permanent. Those are a lot of the things that we saw in the last slide, whether you're blind or deaf. But there's also temporary disabilities, so that will affect anyone in the room, maybe. Like if you break your arm, you might not be able to use a mouse. Situational disabilities include things like if you took your tablet out into the sun, then you can't see it very well. So high contrast would really benefit you. If you need to see a video for work, but you're in a crowded place, you're like in a bus, somewhere where it's very noisy, you really want transcripts or captions to your videos. Or let's say you're drunk, then you have all sorts of things going on. You can't move well, you can't hear well, you can't see well, you can't think well. It's going to be really hard to order an Uber. So, yes. So why does it matter? So the first one is what I always start with, which is it's the right thing to do. So if you think about it, like we have so many good things that have come from the internet and from technology that have made our lives easier. We can order our groceries delivered to us. We can access information that we could never access before. But also, it's necessary for daily life in some cases, whether you're paying your bills or you're registering for classes. And we don't want to leave people with disabilities behind. So web accessibility is essential for providing everyone with equal opportunity. Secondly, which is probably more convincing, is web accessibility is required by law in many situations. So I'm sure you've heard of some of the lawsuits that have been out there regarding accessibility. Or if you are a federal agency or you work with a federal agency, you might be familiar with Section 508, which we'll go over later. But yes, in those cases, you can't get around it. It's required. And the last reason is it makes good business sense. Web accessibility benefits everyone, not just people with disabilities. And here are some of the accessibility benefits. You have improved usability, better SEO. It aligns with mobile compatibility. You have cleaner code since a lot of accessibility is within your code. And like you saw before, it's necessary for situational disability, so it really helps all your users, not just users with disabilities. Which guidelines should I choose? Yes, there are guidelines. You can't just say, oh yeah, I was thinking of them when I was making this. No, there's a set of guidelines that you have to follow to say that you're compliant. When we're talking about guidelines, we're usually talking about two different guidelines. Section 508, which I mentioned earlier, as well as WCAG. So Section 508. Section 508 is a federal law that requires technology used by the federal government be accessible to people with disabilities. WCAG 2.1. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a series of internationally recognized and adopted standards produced by the Worldwide Web Consortium for improving accessibility. So the W3C is very reputable. If you haven't heard them, they write the specifications for like HTML, CSS, yes. So let's compare the two. Section 508 only applies to the United States, whereas WCAG is international. Like I said, Section 508 is law. You can't get around it. It's mandated. Whereas WCAG is really a set of recommendations. Section 508 applies to other technologies besides web content, whereas WCAG is only for web content. Section 508 applies to federal agencies or any company that does business with a federal agency. WCAG applies across the board. So which should I choose? WCAG 2.0 is the most widely accepted accessibility standard for digital environments. So I mentioned WCAG 2.1. That's actually a newer specification, which includes WCAG 2.0, but it has additional stuff, which we'll see in a bit. But yes, currently WCAG 2.0 is the most widely accessible or accepted standard. Last year, Section 508 was actually refreshed. So it now requires that you follow WCAG 2.0, level AA. So for this talk, we will be conforming to WCAG 2.0, level AA. And so if you don't have a specification told to you to follow, I would definitely recommend using this one. So let's go over the history of WCAG. So it was established in 1999 with WCAG 1.0. It wasn't until 2008 with WCAG 2.0 that it started to gain traction. They introduced what we call the POR principles. We'll go over that later. And also levels of conformance. So you saw AA, that's a level of conformance. Last year, WCAG 2.1 was released. That includes everything with WCAG 2.0, but it also added additional guidelines to account for other things that were left out, such as mobile. So the POR principles. So the first one is perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. Understandable. Information and the operation of user interface must be understandable. Yeah, you could probably deduce what it means just by the name, but I'm writing them down here for you guys. Robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide array of user agents, including assistive technologies. So with these principles, they are divided into guidelines, and guidelines have testable success criteria, and that's what you would use to test that your site is accessible. So these testable or success criteria, they come in 3 levels. So as I had mentioned, we are aiming for level AA. Level A is kind of considered the bare minimum, like all websites should abide by that. Level AA is the mid-range, and that deals with most barriers. And level AAA is kind of like the gold standard. That's the highest level. And I know you're thinking, well, if that's the highest level, why don't we just all do level AAA? And that's because some of the criteria with level AAA is not really cost beneficial. Like one of the guidelines is having sign language for every video. And as a company, you need to outweigh the cost versus the benefit. So level AA is perfectly acceptable, and it's the most common. Oh, sorry. Also, so level AAA also includes AA and A, and level AA will also include A. So if you do AAA, you have all of them, yes. So let's look at the structure again. So as I mentioned, there's 4 principles, and then there's guidelines, which are then divided into testable success criteria. So let's take a look at an example. So principle 1, perceivable. One of the guidelines is guideline 1.3, adaptable. Create content that can be presented in different ways without losing information or structure. And then one of the success criteria is 1.3.2, meaningful sequence. This is a level A guideline. And that says the reading and navigation order is logical and intuitive. So as developers, that's what you would use to test whether or not you've met that criteria. Okay, so we get to how can I do my part as a developer? Before we start, we really need to understand what web accessibility means from a technical point of view. So what we have is the accessibility tree. And that's a subset of the DOM tree that contains accessible objects that should be exposed to assistive technologies. So here's a diagram. We have our HTML, and as you all know, that translates into the DOM tree. The DOM tree can be manipulated by JavaScript, but be very careful with that, of course. And the DOM tree will also translate into the accessibility tree. So as you see up here, it's painted into a visual UI, but it's also transformed into an accessibility tree. And that accessibility tree is what we send over to an assistive technology, which then gets sent to the user. So for us, this is what we want to do as a developer. We want to provide enough information to the accessibility tree so that an assistive technology can use it and translate it to the user, if that makes sense. Is there any questions on that? Yes. So a screen reader is an example of an assistive technology that uses that accessibility tree. And a screen reader will provide the user with the following information: the element's role or type, its name, its value if it has one, the element's state if applicable. So that would be something like, is it enabled, is it disabled, is the checkbox checked, or is it not checked? And also the element's relationship to other elements. Okay, so let's take a look. See here. Oh, are there any questions so far, or can go see the example first? Yes. So I created 2 very simple web pages. Yes. It contains different elements so that we can go over the accessibility of each element. So we have like headers, lists, a form, an iframe. I've also created a second one, which looks very similar, but it's not accessible. Yes. So that goes to show that even if it looks like your design, it could not be accessible. So how do we look into the accessibility tree? Well, we are currently in Chrome, by the way. If you inspect your element, you may have noticed a tab here called Accessibility. Can you all see it? Okay. Yes, so this is actually where you can see the accessibility tree. And then here are all the properties associated with this element. As you can see, name is blank, and the role is generic container, because they've styled this button from a div, so it doesn't actually have the role of button. Let's go ahead and look at the one that is accessible. As you can see here, it's much better. It has a name, the role is button, and it also has some extra information. So all of this would be given to the screen reader. So now let's take a look at a screen reader. So I'll be using VoiceOver. VoiceOver is the default screen reader for Mac. If you have Windows, it would be Narrator. There's also paid ones like JAWS and free ones like NVDA. But for this one, we're going to use VoiceOver, and they all act pretty similar, except sometimes they might read things just a bit differently.
So we're on Chrome 2x7. You are online. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow. VoiceOver off.
So that's what it sounds like, but I'm going to mute it because I'm going to talk to it. It's really hard to talk over it. But as you can see, you'll be able to see what it's saying in the corner. It'll pop up. So let's do that again. Oh, okay, so it's still talking. Is there a way to cut?
Press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
Sorry, give me 2 seconds.
VoiceOver off.
Is there a way to turn off, or hold on? Nope. Right? That should mean it doesn't talk right. Okay. Let's try that one more time.
VoiceOver on Chrome.
Okay, so it wants to go ahead and talk, so I'm just going to let it talk. Yes. See, it can get kind of annoying, right? But yes. Okay, so for example, I'm so sorry. Oh, I tried lowering the volume, but it was like also disabled. Oh, is there like a volume here? Maybe, no. Maybe it's that. I'm not. I'm a developer, but not very technical. Okay. So yes, anyways, as you saw, I have snippets of it. Oh, thank you, Russ. Yes, thank you so much. Oh, yes. Start button. Oh, great. A room full of people with technology. Very good. Is that better? Oh, it's better. That's better. Okay, we'll do that. I can talk over that. Okay. Yes. Okay, let's try again. Oh, Great, awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so let's go to our not accessible example. Like if you click into it, it says edit text blank, which is like no information for the user. They have no idea what that means. If you go to our accessible example, it'll give you a lot of information. The name, it's required, there's invalid data because it's blank, the role. So as you can see, adding those things to the accessibility tree makes it so that the screen reader can actually see it. Well, I guess translate it to whatever they need. Another example of how it's accessible, if I, as you can see here, let me try one more. Sorry. Please enter your name. Dynamic errors, it'll read out the dynamic error for the user. So that's something we'll be doing in code, and I'll show you how we do that. Also, there's something called the rotor. The rotor is something the screen reader provides so that a user can navigate to different sections. If you think about it, when you're reading through a document like this, you're probably not going to read every single thing in order to find the information you want. You're going to want to like jump to certain headers or maybe even different landmarks, right? If you want to go to the main or the footer. So this gives the user the ability to navigate the page more naturally. Okay. We are going to take a quick look at the code, but I have code snippets in my presentation that you can see. Yes, it's light theme. It's code in light theme. You've never seen that before, have you? Okay. So here's the inaccessible example. As you can see, we have a case of divide us where I use divs for everything. Yes. Here we have the accessible example, and here we're using semantic HTML. Okay, so let's get back to the presentation. Okay, so semantic HTML. Semantic HTML is the use of semantic elements or elements with meaning instead of using non-semantic ones. What this means is take your case of divide us and change it into something nicer like this. So we want to use semantic HTML because it's already accessible. As you saw, we're using semantic HTML and it's already adding information to the accessibility tree. Whereas the other button, which was actually a div styled to be a button, that had no accessibility built in. We would have to add additional attributes in order for the accessibility tree to see it. Before we get started, some things that we do have to add for accessibility. We have to indicate the language. So here in your HTML tag, you want to put the language in whatever language you need. Screen readers typically need this to know how to pronounce things. Also, if you are changing language midway through your page, make sure to also set the language again for that element. We need a title, which is straightforward enough. And then we also don't want to restrict the zooming. So a common mistake is setting maximum scale to 1, and that'll restrict the zooming. So don't do that. Another note, your code quality. You want to make sure that your code parses correctly. That's one guideline, which is 4.1.1. If a screen reader sees broken HTML, it could like mess up and not read it correctly. So for parsing, make sure that you have no duplicate element attributes, properly open and close tags, no duplicate element IDs, and also indicate the doc type. And that's how you indicate the doc type. Just put that like at the very beginning of your HTML. So let's look at keyboard navigation. So guideline 2.1.1 keyboard, all functionality of the content is operable through the keyboard interface. So that basically means we want to make sure that everything can be tabbed into, but only items that are interactive. So text, you don't have to be able to tab into it. You don't need to add a tab index. So again, with semantic HTML, you have some nice freebies here. You get built-in focus. You don't have to add that. So links with an href, buttons, inputs, selects, and text areas all have built-in focus. if you have a button that's really a span or a div, you're going to have to add in the focus yourself. And to do that, you would use tab index. So for tab index, if you add 0, it'll add it to the tab order in the natural order it's in the page. If it's -1, it's going to completely take it out. So for hidden elements, you want to make sure you set the tab index to -1. We don't want to set it anything higher than 0, because then you'll have to reorder everything on the page, if that makes sense, because it'll go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then if you add something else, you'd have to renumber everything. So don't do that. It's a headache. Yes. 1.3.1, info and relationships. So information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. So when I brought up the rotor, some of those relationships you could see, like the different regions and the different headings. Also things like lists. You wouldn't be able to see that as a blind user, but that's something that is important to know. Also information in tables. If you're navigating through a table, you want to kind of know where you are in the table. So we'll go ahead and show you how to do that. So landmarks. Landmarks would include header, footer, nav, main, and aside. So if you add that to your code, you get this nice little landmarks tab on your rotor. Headings. So the headings is really nice. It's kind of like a table of contents, very easy to navigate. So be sure to use headings when you can instead of like spans or like divs. That way it'll add it to the rotor. Some things to note about headings. Use them based off of importance, not by style. So I see a lot of developers choosing the size they want, and then they're like, okay, H6, we'll use that one. But start with H1, and then restyle it to be whatever you want. It shouldn't correlate to the size of your text. Also make sure that there's only one H1, and that's the first one on the page. And do not skip any levels, because that'll make it confusing for the users. Lists. So this is a list, the navigation menu. I just took a screenshot of it here. So if you were on your screen reader and you clicked into About, it would read it as link about. So you will not know that this is actually part of a list. If you change your code so that you're actually using a list, yes. So if you notice here, we have divs and spans. Although it looks the same, use a list. That way the screen reader knows that there's many items here. So this would read it as list 3 items. And then when you go into About, it'll say link about 1 of 3. So the user knows that there's a relationship there, and there might be more items in the list that they want to go to. Tables. So tables can get pretty complicated. My advice is just avoid complex tables altogether. Here we're going to go over the basic table. What we want to do is first associate this title to the table. And to do that, we're going to add it as a caption. And we also want the user to be aware of where they are in the table, so the row or the column. So this is the table without any accessibility in it. To add accessibility, what we're going to do is, first of all, add that caption. And then we're going to change the headers to TH to let the user know that's a heading. We also want to add a scope. So you want to say either col or row, so they know that's a column header or a row header. And so what does this do for us? OK, so let's say we are in this cell right here. Without scope, it would just read what's in the cell, the most basic web accessibility features. And that gives the user no information that they're inside a table or what does that correspond to. It's not very good for them. If we add the accessibility in, it'll read it differently. So if you're moving down a column, it's assumed that you already know what the column header is. So it's only going to read the row. So it'll say row 2 of 4, which is nice. It'll tell you how many rows there are. And then it'll read it. So now you have more context behind it. If you're moving across the row, it'll read the column header. So yeah, does that make sense? Makes it much easier for them to know where they are. OK, so HTML elements. There's some things you have to add to certain HTML elements to make them accessible, and so we're going to go over them now. So the guideline that we're trying to cover is 1.1.1, non-text content. All non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. We also want to do 4.1.2, name, role, and value. So if you recall a few slides ago, the screen reader will give this information to the user, so we have to make sure that it does have the information that it needs inside the accessibility tree. So for all user interface components, the name and role can be programmatically determined. So let's start with images. This is an image that we had on our site. The screen reader would read this as this kind of crazy PNG file and then image. But that might not mean anything to a user, or it might be kind of confusing, especially if it was like a decorative image, in which case they probably wouldn't want to hear about it at all. So something to note, you always need an alt text. If it's decorative, then leave it empty, but you always need one. So make sure your images always have an alt text. So a null alt text for decorative images. If you have a descriptive image, or informative image, make sure your text is very descriptive of what the image is. So here we have the code for the non-accessible one. Yes. So I would consider this decorative. It's just to make the site pretty. It has a lot of colors. So I just emptied that out here. Inputs. They must have an associated label. So if you remember, it was reading edit text blank, and the user has no idea what that means or what the field is for. Don't use placeholders in place of labels, because it's not going to read a placeholder. And actually, placeholders are usually like really bad contrast, so it's not accessible in that way as well. When necessary, use appropriate autocomplete and type attributes. So if you have something like an email or phone number, something like that, you can add an autocomplete feature so that when you're in the browser, it'll like pull down like your recent phone numbers or recent emails, and it makes it easier for the user. It's actually better user experience as well. If you have a type on it, if you use a different device like a phone and the type is phone, then it'll show like a different keyboard. So those things are nice to have. So here is the code for this inaccessible text box. And there are two ways to associate a label to an input. The first one is the explicit way, and that's to add this little for, and then put the ID of what it's for, if that makes sense, yeah. And now you've automatically associated them. Also noticed here, I added required, because although it adds, or required adds it to the accessibility tree, visually you also want users with sight to know that it's required. We have the type, autocomplete, email. But yes, the second method is to do it implicitly, and you would just put the label and the input, or the text of the label and the input inside the label itself, and it'll associate it the same way. Links. So for links, make sure that you have a non-empty href attribute, and that users are able to navigate to that link by keyboard. So when's a time that a link might not be accessible and a user can't navigate to it? One example that I see sometimes is they change the href to this pound sign, and then they put like a mouse over event on it, but that's not going to be triggered by a keyboard, so be aware of that. Yes, and then this is very simple, straightforward, how you usually use links. Iframes. So iframes, they just need a title. So if you were to go to this inaccessible one, it would read frame 0, which is kind of confusing. So if you add a title, it'll read directions to code on the beach, group. I don't know why VoiceOver reads it as group. Different screen readers read it differently, but it's still better than frame 0. Right? Okay, so element summary. So these are all of the elements that you need to be aware of and what you actually have to add to them. Yep, so we went over them. If you're going to forget, you can take a picture of that. Yeah. Yes, okay, good.
For the links, when you do the bookmarking within the page, and you say like go to doc or something, like you still use hash, there's no valid URL there, so will it be kind of a concern for the accessibility?
So what we don't want them to do is not be able to access the functionality. So on mouse over is the inaccessible part, since you can't trigger that through keyboard. Although you could add JavaScript to actually trigger that, but we'll get into JavaScript later. But yes, okay.
And why does this disclaimers for most of the signups will be very small text and nobody sue them actually? So because it's purposeful.
I'm not sure. Maybe someone should get on that and
take that. Not following on this kind of accessible standards, why even 508? I don't think that kind of a text will be eligible for not being violated or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yes, that's something you had to take.
I find it suit on that disclaimer.
Yes.
Complete violation of accessibility. Even 508 rule, if you never follow that disclaimers, it's very small text, nobody can read it. It's just to dodge their kind of disclaimers.
Yeah, I agree, but maybe they're trying to trick you. That's why it's so small. No, just kidding. There was like a dark UX talk. It was very fascinating.
Yeah, so Facebook is paying $5 million for not giving it, so it's going to.
Yes. Okay. So that's it for semantic HTML. Now what we have is YARIA. I'm sure some people have heard of YARIA because they don't use semantic HTML and they just pop YARIA everywhere. That's the wrong thing to do. Start with semantic HTML, and then we're going to use YARIA only for filling in accessibility gaps. So that's most useful for any kind of custom control, and we will see an example of that right now. Okay, so here's a custom control. This is not actually a checkbox. It's very deceiving. It looks like a checkbox, but yes, it's a div. And in order for you to add that to the accessibility tree, you have to give it information such as the role and its state. However, all it does is add information to the accessibility tree. It will not actually add any functionality. So it'll always be checked true unless you add some JavaScript in there to say, now it's false. So the attributes that ARIA offers. There's role, as you saw. So define what an element is or does, such as landmark rows. This is actually useful in some cases. So for example, the role of search, that's not a landmark that we have. But if you add the role search to an element, then it'll show up in your landmarks tab in the rotor. Properties. Define properties of elements which can be used to give them extra meaning or semantics. The most common one is ARIA labels. So people use that to make their their divs from their devices have certain labels in. So sometimes you see people put ARIA label everywhere. States, and that's what we saw with the checkbox. They define the current conditions of the element. So as we said, why ARIA should be used to supplement semantic HTML, not replace it. It's not really good code to just use your ARIA label, hammer everything. Yes, you only want to use it very sparingly if you need it. As I said, it only affects how it appears in the accessibility tree. It doesn't add any additional functionality. So if you want to toggle any of those states, it has to be done in JavaScript. So here are actually some good uses of ARIA. Like we mentioned, navigation. So sometimes you have a landmark that is repeated, like banner, banner. You can use ARIA to say banner, heading, banner, some example you make up in your head. I'm not good with tables. So for complex tables, you might want to use the ARIA options because they have some extra things like row groups and things like that. So you can add some information to nested tables. And also dynamic content updates. And that's what I showed you earlier. So if you're filling out a form and an error pops up, your user needs to know that error occurred. So that has to be read directly to the user at that time. So how do we do that? We do that with ARIA Live. So ARIA Live regions are simple mechanisms for notifying screen readers when content is updated on a page. And this is how we do it. We add ARIA Live, and we have assertive. So assertive means that it'll read it immediately once something is updated in here. So what you want to do is whenever content is added in here, it'll read it. I excluded the code for input and submit because it wouldn't fit. I tried to squish it in there, but I gave up and put this comment. Yes, but hopefully you know how to do an input and a submit button. Yes, but the JavaScript would be something simple like this. This is a really trivial JavaScript just to show an example of how you would add information in there. So yep, inner HTML right here. When you've grabbed this error, and you add something in there, and of course focus it back to whatever caused the error. So that's how we did that example I showed you earlier. Okay, so that's it for all the code you have to add. I added this code test, which is very useful if you want to know if your code is all accessible. If it is, you should be able to answer all these questions. Like the screen reader, can all elements that convey content be read? Are element roles identified correctly? Can the page be navigated easily? For the keyboard, is all functionality available using the keyboard? Does the focus order make sense? Are there any keyboard traps? Zoom, can text be resized up to 200% without loss of functionality? We have not gone over this responsive one, but yes, with WCAG 2.1, they introduced this guideline, which is there shouldn't be horizontal scrolling present when the screen is 320 pixels, and for that you would use responsive design, which is also very interesting, and if you want to talk about it, we can talk after this. Okay, so like I said earlier, coding is only one part of accessibility. There's also design things to consider. And while we're not going to get very in-depth with the design things, I want you all to be aware of them so that you can work as a team to make sure all the accessibility issues are addressed together. So if you see something that the designer is violating, don't go up to them and be like, this is not accessible. just have a conversation, let them know, maybe they missed it, but it's good to be aware of this. Yes. So first of all, color. When adding color to your design, be aware of the contrast ratio and do not rely on color alone for conveying information. So as we mentioned, if you took your screen outside, it might be very hard to read. Or if you're demoing somewhere where it has a really bad projector, contrast would be very good to have. Timing. For any timing-based content, provide ways to control the timing, such as a pause button for automatically playing content, or an extend option for time-limited content. So for users with disabilities, it might take them longer to do what a normal user does. So be sure to give them options to adjust the timing if they need it. Navigation. Keep navigation consistent and provide ways for a user to navigate your site, or multiple ways for a user to navigate your site. Allow them to bypass content repeated on multiple web pages. So some ways you could provide other ways to navigate your site is like a sitemap or even like a search. Forms. Help users avoid and correct mistakes by properly highlighting the cause of the error and providing adequate instructions or suggestions for correcting it. So make sure they have enough information to correct that error. Media. Provide transcripts and captions for all audio and video content. Wording, and this might be where your technical writer comes in or product, whoever provides wording. Choose wording that properly conveys its purpose and that consistent wording is used for components with the same functionality. Alternatives. If your design has functionality that may not be available on other devices, such as gestures or hover, provide alternatives. And here's a bunch of design don'ts. So don't restrict the display orientation. So there's some apps where you turn it and it says, oh, it's not meant to be used this way, turn it back. But for some people, they might not have that option. Don't use images of text. Don't remove the focus indicator. So there was actually a very interesting talk yesterday just on focus. Focus could be like a whole topic on its own, but yes, don't remove the focus indicator. When a user is navigating, they need to know where they are on the page. Don't automatically change context on focus or on input. So sometimes people add events that trigger on focus, but for a disabled person who might be using the keyboard, they might want to just skip that, and so they're not wanting to trigger that information. So you don't want them to tab into an input and all of a sudden something else happens. You want them to be able to like skip it and trigger the behavior when they need it. And don't use elements that flash more than 3 times in a second. I'm not sure who would be doing that, but yes, just don't do that. You might trigger some seizures. Yes. So here's some common pitfalls that we've run into when we're developing. First of all, hiding focus. Like I mentioned, it's very important that focus is very visible. Some designers might think it's ugly, but they need to provide an alternative so that the user can see where they're at. Using the wrong elements. So dividus. If you use a div for everything, you're probably doing it wrong. So yes. Thinking about accessibility too late. So you can't build a feature and then have a ticket that says make it accessible. You should really be considering that at the beginning. So as you saw when we were doing our UI, it's very easy to add those elements in. So while you're building it, go ahead and add it in then. Not involving the whole team. So it's very important that your whole team is on board with accessibility. Your other developers should be aware of this when they're doing pull requests. They need to see if they're missing something, be a backup and be like, oh, well, this label will not be accessible. Your QA needs to be aware of it. So whenever they're testing, they need to make sure that something is accessible and didn't break any existing accessibility, or else you're going to see a lot of gaps. Using a components library that does not support accessibility. Yes, so that one's been very painful for us. So we use Vue at Beeline, and we use a library called Vuetify. So do people know about Material? So it's kind of like the Material components library. However, a lot of their controls are not accessible. And there's lots of tickets out there saying that it's not accessible. When will you update it? They still have not. So that's something to be aware of if you're using a components library. Okay, so here's some recommended resources. If you want to learn more about the 2 guidelines, you can always go to their official sites. Pluralsight has a really great course called Meeting Web Accessibility Guidelines. YouTube has a series, Alleycast with Rob Dodson. Very good series, and he breaks it up into very small videos, so you can choose whatever topic you want about accessibility. And web docs. Both the Mozilla and the Google Accessibility web docs are really cool. Okay, so the summary. So as you can see, accessibility benefits everyone. If you're going to be choosing a guideline, choose WCAG 2.1 AA. Use semantic HTML to begin with, and then add ARIA to fill in the accessibility gaps. If you need JavaScript to control some of the ARIA states, be sure to add that. Remember to consider this design. Coding is just really one part of it. Unless you're a one-man shop, then you really need to have the designers take accessibility into consideration as well. And finally, accessibility matters. Yes. Any questions?
What about the captcha and also the I'm not robot kind of scenario? Will it fall into the accessibility? Because they don't comply with that. When you try to make sure that no robots are being scanned for the web pages.
Oh.
Captchas there, right?
That was actually at the Dark UX talk. No, it's not accessible. It's very bad, yes. But yes, that's very bad for them.
A lot of websites, they try to use it for security reasons.
Correct,
so
yes.
nobody's scraping the website pages actually.
Yes, that's true. Yes?
I got a question about for Beeline. What's the role of accessibility? Because Beeline, in terms of process of flow, does that come somewhere between design work and engineering? Do you guys put that on for quality? Like, where does Beeline apply accessibility in the process?
Oh, so when we first heard about all of this accessibility stuff, of course we have our main application, which is more like a legacy application. We had to have an accessibility effort to fill those in. However, for new development, it's part of your code. So it has to be responsive, it needs to be browser compatible, and it has to be accessible. If it doesn't meet that, it won't pass QA.
Are there any automated tools that test compatibility?
There's a lot of tools for the web browser. So if you look up Chrome, they have various ones that will do like an audit of accessibility on your browser and tell you what you need to fix, whether it's like colors or missing labels, things like that. So definitely check those out. Any? Okay, well, oh yes.
I have a question. Do you have recommendations for how to get your team on board with accessibility? Because I feel like our team's like so far into the project, we've never focused on this stuff. So how do you get everybody on board? If you have any.
Yes, it's very difficult to get unless they see like monetary benefits. It's not something that they will automatically do. However, as you saw, some of the benefits that they do provide, like improved SEO, improved usability, those kind of things, you can let whoever's in charge know, just to let them know that accessibility is something to consider. If not, it's likely to come back because the client will need it, and that's usually when accessibility comes. Yeah, very good. Thank you all for coming. I hope you learned something. Thank you.